All right, so those ecosystem services, again, take a second, just Google, ecosystem services, and it'll come up with a huge list of things. In addition to that, you can look at that 2020 AP exam sheet that is on Google Classroom. Any of those services can be used for it, whether they're the aesthetic beauty of the forest offering enjoyment to people, whether it's tourism of people coming to those national forests to go and see the scenery, tourism for the rainforest ecosystems. It could be oxygen production and CO2 absorption and all those things we talked about at the beginning. So as long as you're describing them, again, listing what it is and then giving some elaboration on it, you're answering the what part of the how, what, and why. So uh, the second one, describe 2 methods for mitigating the human impacts of forest ecosystems for clear cutting. Again, you can go back through, rewatch that video. That's just ways to lessen our impact on those forest ecosystems. Using alternatives to wood products, reducing the demand, using ecologically sustainable forestry techniques, selective cutting, certification programs where they're certifying that the trees were harvested sustainably, or replanting opportunities where we take an area that was deforested and we reforest it. The good news is with this last one, in the more economically developed countries, our amount of forested land is pretty stagnant. It's pretty steady. And if anything, it might even be increasing a bit because we've gotten to the point where it's big income for us. So we want to manage those resources sustainably in our economy. Even the places that are clear cutting in our country, they are doing clear cutting in a more sustainable fashion than they are in the less economically developed world because we are implementing replanting techniques. We are making sure that new forested land is growing before we're cutting the next tract down. So we're actually replanting at a rate that we're seeing in America more forested land now than we did at the turn of the last century. So, if you compare pre-1900s to current, we have more forested land. The less economically developed countries are where we need to make the biggest impact. So when we look at this next section, it's going to be getting in the farming now. The Green Revolution and impacts of agriculture. So the Green Revolution was a way that we found to increase our output of food. We had an exponentially growing population on our planet. We needed to find a way to feed those. That got into that Malthusian principle. Remember how we talked about exponentially growing population, but linear growing resource supply? Where they crossed over, that was where we were going to get into that catastrophic point where people were going to start dying. So we needed to have increased agricultural output using the same amount of land because with more people on the planet, we couldn't expand the borders of our farms. We had to find better ways to farm. So they did that a bunch of different ways. They did it by better crop varieties that were higher yielding crop varieties. They did it by understanding that we could grow monocultures where we plant one plant over the same field year after year after year. They understood all these different aspects of it. They started looking at farming scientifically. So the first way they did it was mechanization. Mechanization drastically increased the size of farms that people could farm. Now, instead of having 50 farmers each farming 10 acres or 100 acres, now they had 5 farmers each farming 100,000 acres or 10,000 acres. 100,000 is a bit much, but 10,000 acre farms not unheard of now. So mechanization allows them to do that. They may have 7 or 8 tractors running through a field farming at the same time, where before that would have taken 15, 20, 30 people to do without mechanization. In addition, we started the genetically modified organisms. We provided different resistances. We increased our pest resistance. We increased drought tolerance. We did a bunch of different things to up the yields. This was where we were able to take genes of dissimilar plants. So before, we were always altering the genes of plants, but we were doing it through artificial selection. That was the first way that we started to up our yields, was we used artificial selection to create dwarf varieties. We found that a lot of the energy was going into providing, large, huge plants, but those large, huge plants weren't edible. Only a small portion of it was edible. So instead of putting energy towards growing that large, huge plant, we only wanted to grow large, huge edible portions of it. So if it's a tomato plant, we don't want a 12-foot tall tomato plant that we're not going to eat the stems and the branches. We're only eating the little fruits. So we could have a 12-foot tomato plant that only grows 3-inch tomatoes, but it would be better if that energy that went towards growing that 12-foot tomato plant, now it's only growing a 3-foot plant, but the tomatoes are 6 or 12 inches big. So bigger fruits on smaller plants gives us the ability to increase our yields, because now same amount of space is taken up from a footprint standpoint, but we're producing more edible parts of it, uh, uh, using that same amount of land. They did this with wheat, they did it with corn, a bunch of those different things. The other thing they did, they started using synthetic fertilizers, synthetic pesticides. And that tied back into the GMO thing, because we use synthetic pesticides to kill off all the pests, so we didn't lose as many crops. But we wanted to find a way that we could, spray the field with pesticide without killing the crops while still, killing the pests. They did that by inserting genetic resistance to the pesticide. The synthetic fertilizers, this is what gave us the ability to grow monocultures. When we grew monocultures, we got more efficient at it. And then also we had better technology, so we were able to irrigate more efficiently. So knowing these is one thing. We also need to know the positives and negatives of each of them. So take a second, think through about what benefit and drawback we get from these. So with fertilizers, for instance, N and P, those are the big nutrients. Those are the living nutrients in ecosystems, the nitrates and the phosphates. So as we're adding those synthetically, now we're going to over-fertilize the land. When we're over-fertilizing the land, we have increased chances of that fertilizer running off in the bodies of water and causing that eutrophication process. That eutrophication process is going to drastically impact the quality. It's going to drastically impact the quality of our water. So that's one drawback to it. The benefit of it is we were able to drastically increase our yield, so we're feeding more people. Synthetic pesticides, a drawback to those is that by spraying the fields with pesticides, now the bees come in to pollinate. The bees are ingesting that pesticide and being exposed to it. They then die. We're losing our pollinators, and we're losing them at an exponential rate. So now we're losing some of those ecosystem services that we have. Pollination is one of the big ecosystem services. It's a supporting or regulating service, mainly supporting service, where it's allowing other things to happen. By having pollination, we have increased biodiversity. Increased biodiversity makes the ecosystems more stable. So all of these have pros and cons to them, and that's what you're going to need for the AP exam this year, is that ability to connect everything. Now, So another thing that people don't think about is that mechanization part. They only think of mechanization as a good thing, but the more machinery we use, the more fossil fuel energy we have to use. So not only we're producing it on 1 or 2 farms, and they're now mega producers that are shipping it all over the country. As opposed to growing locally, we're growing regionally or at the national level, and that's getting shipped everywhere. So that's more fossil fuel energy we need for shipping, but it's also increasing the fossil fuel energy that they're using for the machineries on the farm. Those big tractors aren't very efficient. So they're efficient from a standpoint of harvesting and things, but they're not very fuel efficient. So we're becoming more reliant on fossil fuel energy as we mechanize more and more. All right, so check for understanding on this part. Describe 2 farming practices that can have negative environmental consequences, and explain those negative environmental consequences for the practices you listed above. I think I'm just going to let you guys go with this. You guys can watch back in the video. We kind of talked about those anyway. This is more something that you can do on your own. Rewind the video, check for your understanding, and go with that. If you have questions on any of these, send me an email. Say, hey, this is what I think that my answer would be. Would this earn points? So another part of the Green Revolution was using irrigation. So we need to talk about the irrigation methods that we have. Irrigation is the #1 consumer of fresh water worldwide. It's over 70% of all fresh water used in the world goes towards irrigating crops. And depending on what type of irrigation you're using, it could be efficient or very inefficient. And when we talk about the efficiency of irrigation, again, we're talking about the amount of water lost through evaporation or through absorption that doesn't reach the roots of the plants or even runoff of the field. So we have 4 different methods: drip, flood, furrow, and spray. And again, as we're going through these, think about the benefits and the drawbacks of each. So our first one here, look at the picture, see if you can get an idea for which type of irrigation this would be. If you said drip, you're correct. So think back to when we talked about this in the school year. Is drip beneficial, harmful, which one, and why? So think about some pros and cons of the drip irrigation. You can pause it, think about that. So the good part, it's our most efficient. We have less than 5% loss of water. There's very little evaporation, and we can even minimize that even further by doing a few other things. If we cover the ground with mulch, for instance, that holds the moisture in even better. Now we lose even less. The reason why it's so efficient is when we look back here, those tubes of water are dripping the water directly on the roots of the plant. So we're not losing any water, we're directly applying it to the roots. We're not spraying it on dirt that doesn't need to be irrigated. Soil that doesn't need to be irrigated. I said the bad D word. So the bad part of it, the cons of it, it's our most expensive method, which makes it our least common. It also works best with perennial plants, but we don't plant perennial plants on farms very often. So when we're a strawberry farmer, this is going to work great for that. If we're an orchard, a fruit orchard, this is going to work great with that. But we don't do a lot of that on industrial scale farms. Those are, some of the smaller farms. I guess apple orchards and orange orchards and things like that, yes. But a lot of times with those trees, we don't water those anyway. Those are left but to water through rainfall. So this is a method we should be using. We don't use it because it's the most expensive and least common. This method, go ahead and think through, see if you can remember what this one's called. If you said spray, you're correct. Now, just looking at this picture, you can probably get an idea that it's probably not going to be as efficient as drip because hopefully you guys see they're spraying it over the entirety of the field. It's hitting the dirt without crops growing and the dirt, again, the soil with crops growing and the soil without crops growing in it. The other thing, take a second, see what you can also come up with as far as goods and bads go with this. So maybe you guys said, hey, we need to pressurize that water and we need to pump it from further away. So this one's going to use a lot of fossil fuel energy because we need pumps to function to take that water and transport it the distances we need to grow these crops. It also has to be under great pressure to be able to spray through the fields like it is. So that's a drawback to it. It's still going to be efficient. It's less than 25% loss, which is still pretty good. We can get it down to that 10% loss fairly easily as well by using more precise application type sprinkler heads, low flow heads and low water waste heads. That's not spraying a huge spray of water. It's more of a light mist and it's hitting the plants more directly. The bads of it, again, it's going to be expensive. Not as expensive as drip, but we still have to buy equipment for it. So it's going to require the pumping of water, which uses fossil fuels. It's going to be expensive, and it has the ability to overuse our groundwater. Now we're going to take the water from the ground, pump it up to the surface. Since it is inefficient, we're going to be losing a lot of the water that we're putting on the fields. One of the big problems with this is the overpumping of aquifers. And if you remember from the unit earlier this year, aquifers are underground water deposits. They're where the water table saturates the soil. And these aquifers can both be confined or unconfined. The confined are going to be able to, are not able to recharge. The unconfined aquifers are able to recharge as the water percolates downward. But that recharge rate tends to be very slow because these aquifers are 100 feet, 200 feet down below the surface. That takes a lot of time for that water to soak down through. So the problem with this is we end up putting water on our fields at a rate faster than it's being replaced into the aquifer. So we're over pumping the groundwater. When we over pump the groundwater, now that level of the aquifer goes down considerably. We're to the point where we are over pumping aquifers to the point where they're going completely dry. When they go dry, they have the ability to collapse in on themselves. If they collapse in, they can no longer be recharged. So pause it, see if you can remember what the world's largest aquifer is. Some of you guys may have remembered, it's that Ogallala or Ogallala aquifer out in our Midwestern states. It's that aquifer that covers, I think it's 15 or 16 different states, and we're drastically overpumping that. That's our breadbasket where we're doing most of our farming. It's an example of the tragedy of the commons. Again, tying that into everything here. All the farmers in this area are pumping water from the same shared resource. These farmers may be doing it with drip irrigation sustainably, but all of these ones in here aren't. They're using the spray irrigation and they're over applying the water. So they're over pumping the water, taking that resource of it away from the farmers who need it that are practicing the more sustainable methods. Eventually, that resource then goes away. The other thing we have, so the other thing you have to think about, it's not just irrigation that we're using this aquifer for. There's people that are getting drinking water from it as well. If we lose it for farming, we're losing it for drinking as well. Okay, our next method, pretty self-evident from this picture that it's flood irrigation. Flood is going to be the worst. It's going to be the most inefficient. Sorry, I went blank there. It loses over 20% of the water, a high chance of waterlogging the soil. You can think back to what waterlogging was. It's where all of the pores in the soil end up getting saturated with, saturated with water, where the roots of the plants can no longer take oxygen in or release oxygen out. So they end up dying off. They start to rot. They're rotting underwater. So it's anaerobic decomposition, which is going to release methane. But it's very cheap. So in the less economically developed countries, this is sort of their go-to for a lot of plants that are, heavy water plants. The other one that's very similar is furrow irrigation. Furrow, now instead of flooding the entire field, you're flooding little trenches beside the crop rows. Those flooded trenches, again, a lot of water running off and never reaching the plants, a lot of water evaporating out. So this is very inefficient. It's about, anywhere from a half to a third, 20% to 33%, somewhere around in that range, inefficient. I know I said that flood was the worst. Flood's the worst from an environmental standpoint, but from a loss standpoint, the furrow irrigation is worse. Again, this can still lead to waterlogging. It can still lead to other problems with it too. But since it's cheap and a lot of places have water sources readily available at the surface, it's often used in those less economically developed countries. So overall negatives of irrigation. You should always have your kind of two go-to things in your back pocket for these. Negatives of irrigation in general, I'm not talking about any specific one, are soil salinization, waterlogging, and aquifer depletion. We haven't talked about salinization, but we did that lab with it. Remember how we said the water has a mixture of water and salts in it. Those salts are the minerals that have dissolved into it. Those get left behind when the water we irrigate with gets sprayed on the field. They're left behind, they get incorporated into the soil. The more irrigation we do, the more salts that are present. Eventually you can get to the point where it reduces the productivity of the land because those salts prevent or inhibit plant growth. Pros of irrigation, again, you should always have two good things. This allowed us to create new farmland. We were able to farm in areas that normally would have been too dry to farm in. And it also allowed us to increase our yields. We were able to plant varieties of plants that were more water demanding than what we used to. Those more water demanding plants might have produced more food per unit of acre or unit of area, of farmland. So that's going to allow us to increase our yield. So go ahead, check your understanding. Again, you can go back in the video to double check to make sure you're correct. Email me if you guys have questions whether you're correct or not.